My father grabbed my elbow in front of 200 guests at the most important dinner of his career, leaned in close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath, and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "You've embarrassed this family long enough. You're nothing but hired help, and everyone in this room knows it." I didn't say a word. I stood exactly where I was, clipboard held against my chest, and looked at him calmly. 20 seconds later, a woman seated at the head table touched the sleeve of one of my staff members and asked quietly, "Excuse me, the woman standing over there, is she the owner of this company?" The room shifted, and in the 5 seconds it took for the answer to travel back across that ballroom, something my father had spent 30 years building began, quietly and completely, to fall apart. Before I tell you what happened in that room, I want to tell you about the years that made that moment possible. Because nothing about that evening was an accident. My father's name is Gordon Hartwell, and if you've spent any time in Ottawa's commercial real estate circles over the past 3 decades, you've heard it. He built Hartwell Development from a single office building in Canada into one of the city's most recognizable commercial property firms. He is a man who wears his reputation the way other people wear jewelry, always visible, always polished, always positioned to catch the light. I grew up watching him work a room. The handshake that became a grip, the laugh that was never quite spontaneous enough, the careful way he introduced himself to people he'd already met, just in case they'd forgotten how important he was. He had plans for me. Not surprising, he had plans for everyone. I was supposed to study business, ideally law, and eventually step into the firm. When I finished my degree at Carleton and told him I wanted to work in event management and hospitality instead, he looked at me the way you'd look at someone who had just ordered dessert before dinner. Baffled, vaguely offended. "Events," he said. "You mean you want to set up tables and pour other people's wine for a living?" I said yes, more or less. He didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. That was the beginning of a pattern that would define the next several years of my life. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every birthday my stepmother organized, my father found a way to return to the subject of my choices. Not in a table-pounding way, that wasn't his style. He was much more precise than that. He would wait until the room was full, and the conversation had settled before mentioning, in a perfectly conversational tone, that I was still doing the catering thing. He would ask, thoughtfully and in front of others, whether I'd considered anything more stable. Once, at his firm's holiday party, he told the couple beside us that I'd had such a promising start in life, and that it was a shame the way things had turned out. My brother, who was 10 years younger than me, and already being quietly shaped to take over the firm, laughed the first few times. Eventually he learned to just look at his plate. My stepmother said nothing, which in her case counted as a small mercy. I stopped arguing back somewhere around the 3rd year, not because I agreed with him, but because I had started to understand something important. I was not going to get my father's approval by explaining myself to him. The only language he understood was results, and I wasn't ready to show him mine yet. I had been working at Elmwood Events for just under 2 years when I first started to understand what the company actually was. Not what it looked like from the outside, which was polished, reliably booked for government receptions, law firm galas, corporate awards nights, and the kind of charity dinners that cost $400 a plate, but what it was underneath the surface. The owner, a man named Mr. Cartwright, who had built the business over 22 years, was tired. His back had been giving him trouble. His wife had retired. Their youngest had just moved to British Columbia. He had begun talking, in the careful way people do when they're working up to something, about slowing down. And the finances of the company, I had started to realize, were in considerably worse shape than most people knew. I'd started at Elmwood doing venue logistics, coordinating with caterers, managing setup timelines, handling last-minute changes with the kind of calm that either comes naturally to you or doesn't. Within a year I'd moved into client relations, which is where you learn that the success of any event is only partly about the food and the flowers. It's mostly about reading people, understanding what they need before they know how to ask for it. I was good at that part. I'd had a lot of practice growing up in my father's house. As Mr. Cartwright trusted me with more of the back-end operations, I began seeing the full picture. There were contracts that had gone sideways during the shutdown years. Deposits returned under pressure, sometimes without the legal protection that should have been in place. And there was one account in particular, a large corporate client who had booked and then canceled a 3-day conference, where the resulting financial damage had never been fully recovered. When I looked into the details of that cancellation, I found a name I recognized. The company that had walked away from the contract was a subsidiary connected to a joint venture my father's firm had quietly dissolved. I didn't go straight to conclusions. Business is complicated, and I understood that. But I sat with that information for a long time. The following spring, Mr. Cartwright sat down with me in his office and told me he was thinking seriously about selling. He didn't want to close the company. He wanted to see it continue, but he'd had inquiries from larger event management conglomerates, and he was worried about what that would mean for his staff. Most of them had been with him for years, some since the beginning. I went home that evening and sat at my kitchen table in my apartment in Centertown and thought for a very long time. I had been saving carefully since my first paycheck, a percentage into a TFSA, some into RSPs, a small portfolio of index funds I'd started in my mid-20s. I had enough of a foundation to be taken seriously. Not enough to do this alone. Over the next several months, I made careful phone calls. A former client who had become something of a mentor to me, a woman named Frances who ran her own consultancy and had a quiet instinct for sound investment. 2 others I trusted. Between us, we structured a small acquisition group, registered a numbered holding company in Ontario, and approached Mr. Cartwright with an offer. The negotiations were slow and sometimes difficult. There were moments when I was certain the deal would collapse. But in the end, the numbers worked. Mr. Cartwright believed we would look after his people, and the papers were signed on a Tuesday morning in November, with my lawyer present and almost no one else. I became the owner of Elmwood Events at 31 years old. Mr. Cartwright shook my hand, smiled in a way that looked like relief, and wished me well. And then I went back to work. This is the part people find strange when they learn about it later. I didn't change anything about how I showed up. I didn't move into the corner office. I didn't announce the acquisition to clients. I kept working alongside my team the same way I always had. Because the truth was, I didn't feel finished learning yet. There was still so much about running the business from the inside that I wanted to understand before I started making decisions from the outside. And I was not ready to have the conversation with my father. I knew that conversation would come. But I wanted to be certain, when it did, that everything I had built could speak for itself. The booking came through in late January. My events coordinator knocked on my open office door and said we'd had a confirmed inquiry from the Ottawa Commercial Real Estate Association for their 30th anniversary gala, one of their largest events ever. 215 guests, head table of 12. The contact name was Mrs. Alderton, the association's executive director. I recognized the association immediately. My father had been a founding member. He'd sat on their advisory board for years. This wasn't just any event. It was his event, his crowd, his room. I assigned my senior coordinator to the file and stayed in the background of the planning process. There was no reason for anyone at the association to know the company had changed ownership. We were operating under the same name, the same reputation. Everything continued exactly as it always had. The night of the gala arrived in April, cold and clear the way Ottawa April evenings often are. The sky that particular shade of dark blue that sits just before full dark. I dressed the same way I always did for events. Black blazer, dark trousers, a headset looped around my neck and a radio clipped to my belt. I was on the floor early, walking the room before the doors opened, checking placements, speaking with the kitchen, making sure the audiovisual setup was right for the program. By 7, the ballroom was full and warm, and exactly the way I liked it for a formal dinner, controlled enough to feel elegant, relaxed enough for people to actually enjoy themselves. I was standing near the service corridor around 8 o'clock, checking in with my floor manager, when I heard my name. Not my name from a colleague, my name from my father. He had come from across the room. I hadn't seen him in almost 8 months. We hadn't spoken since a brief, uncomfortable phone call the previous summer. He looked the same. Dark suit, silver cufflinks, the posture of a man who expected to be noticed from a distance, but his expression when he reached me was something I had seen before. The controlled anger of someone who is embarrassed and needs to make it someone else's problem. "What on earth are you doing here?" he said. He wasn't shouting. He was using the voice he kept for moments when he was very angry and very aware that people might be watching. Contained, but still carrying. I told him calmly that I was working. "You're working." He repeated it the way you repeat something that doesn't make sense to you. Then he looked at the headset, at the clipboard under my arm, at the radio on my belt. "You're one of the caterers. At my event." People at the nearest table had stopped their conversation. I was aware of it without looking directly at them. "You need to step back," I said. "This isn't the time." He didn't step back. My father had never, in my memory, stepped back from anything. "Do you have any idea what tonight means?" His voice rose just slightly, controlled, but not quite controlled enough. "Do you understand who is in this room? This is 30 years of work, and my daughter is standing here with a clipboard and a headset like she's working a trade show." He wasn't quite shouting, but he was close enough that the nearby tables had gone quiet in the way where people are very deliberately pretending not to notice. "You had every advantage," he continued. He pointed at me, the same gesture he'd used since I was a child, index finger extended, like he was identifying something that had gone wrong. "Every possible advantage, and you chose this. You chose to be the hired help, and you look at me like I'm the one who should be ashamed." I didn't answer him. I had thought many times over the years about what I would say when this moment finally came, and when it arrived, I found I didn't want to say any of it. I just stood there, arms crossed, quiet, and I let him finish. He turned away after a moment, composing himself, already beginning to move back toward the head table, with the practiced smoothness of a man who has learned to contain his scenes. Then I heard a voice from the head table. A woman, Ruth Nakamura, I would learn her name properly later, a prominent commercial real estate lawyer, and one of the association's most respected longtime members. She was speaking to one of my floor staff, and her voice carried in the way voices do when a room has gone unexpectedly quiet. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said pleasantly. "I've been meaning to ask all evening. Can you tell me who owns Elmwood Events? I have a client who's been looking for a company of this caliber. I'd love to pass along the right name." My staff member, a young woman who had been with the company since long before I arrived, and who knew perfectly well who owned it, glanced briefly in my direction before she answered. "Of course," she said. Miss Hartwell owns the company." She pointed to where I was standing. "She's right there." The pause that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In a room full of 200 people, 3 seconds of unexpected silence is a very long time. My father had half turned back toward the head table when he heard his own last name. I watched him process it. Watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. Ruth Nakamura looked from the staff member to me. Then she stood. She actually stood up from her chair and extended her hand. "Miss Hartwell," she said warmly. "I've heard wonderful things about this company for years. It's a genuine pleasure." I crossed the room and shook her hand. I was aware of my father standing very still 8 feet away. "Thank you," I said. "That means a great deal." Behind Ruth Nakamura, my senior coordinator approached and informed me quietly that there were service contracts from the evening that required my signature before the awards portion of the program began. I excused myself, reviewed the documents, and signed them where indicated. It was a completely ordinary moment of running a business. But in that room, at that moment, it was anything but ordinary to those watching. The silence broke gradually, the way silence does after something irreversible has been said. People returned to their conversations. The program resumed. My floor staff moved through the room, with the smooth, practiced rhythm that I had spent years helping to build. But something had changed in the atmosphere in a way that couldn't be changed back. I didn't make a speech. I hadn't planned one, and I didn't want one. But I did walk to the head table a few minutes later, and I spoke to Ruth Nakamura and to Mrs. Alderton and to a few others who had been close enough to witness everything. I told them I had purchased Elmwood Events 14 months earlier through a holding company, because the alternative was watching a 22-year business and the people who depended on it sold off to an operation that would have stripped everything down and started over. I told them I had kept working on the floor, because that was the only kind of leadership I knew. From the inside of things, not above them. I told them about the staff who had been here before me and what we had built together since. I didn't mention my father by name. I didn't have to. Ruth Nakamura listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded once. "That," she said, "is a sound business decision, and a principled one." The days after the gala moved quietly but with a weight I could feel. My father called the following afternoon. I let it ring. He left no message. He called again 3 days later, and this time I answered. The conversation was brief and carefully worded in the way conversations are when both people are being very deliberate. He said he thought we should talk in person. I said I agreed. We met at a coffee shop in the Glebe on a Saturday morning, neutral ground, the kind of place where the tables are close enough together that neither of you is going to say anything you'll later regret. He was there before me. He looked smaller somehow, which was not something I had ever thought about my father. He didn't lead with a direct apology. He isn't built for those, and I've made my peace with it. What he said was that he had been thinking, and that he understood he had been wrong about a great many things, and that he would like, if I was willing, to understand what I had built. I sat with that for a moment, then I told him there were things I needed to say first. I told him I had spent a long time waiting for his respect, and had eventually understood that waiting for it was never going to help me get it. I told him that everything I had built was mine, every decision, every risk, every early morning and late evening, and that I was not ashamed of how I'd built it. I told him that if we were going to have any relationship going forward, it was going to be one where he spoke to me as someone capable of making her own choices, not as a disappointment he was managing. He nodded. He didn't argue. He said he thought he could do that. I told him I hoped so. I didn't walk out of that coffee shop feeling triumphant. I walked out feeling something quieter, a kind of clarity, the understanding that I had spent years trying to solve a problem that wasn't mine to solve. My father's inability to see value in work he didn't understand was not something I could fix for him. It was something he would have to decide to fix himself. What I could do, what I had done, was stop waiting for his judgment before I trusted my own. The months that followed were some of the strongest in the company's history. We brought on 3 new government contracts and expanded the team. I promoted 2 people who had been at Elmwood since long before I arrived, and who deserved the recognition. I hired a director of operations to handle more of the administrative load, which freed me to focus on the parts of the business I had always loved, the clients, the events, being on the floor when it mattered. My brother called me in the summer. He was awkward about it at first, which was fair. He said he'd heard about the gala from a couple of my father's colleagues, and that he wanted to say he thought I'd handled everything with a lot of class. I thanked him. We talked for almost an hour about things that had nothing to do with our father, and it was the easiest conversation we'd had in years. The thing no one tells you about building a life outside of someone else's expectations is that the hardest part isn't the beginning. The beginning, I had found, was manageable. You find your people, you find your work, you find the version of yourself that exists when no one is measuring you against a standard you never chose. The hardest part is the long middle, the years when you are building something real, and no one who matters to you can see it yet. When you're setting up tables at 6 in the morning in a ballroom that won't fill until evening, and somewhere across the city your father is telling people you've wasted your potential, and you have to trust. You have to actively choose to trust that the work itself is enough. I believed it was. I still do. Not because I was proven right in some dramatic public way, though I suppose I was, in a ballroom in April in front of 200 people who won't soon forget that evening, but because I was doing work I was proud of, with people I respected, towards something I had chosen entirely on my own terms. My greatest victory wasn't the look on my father's face when he heard his own last name spoken back to him in a room he thought he owned. It was the Tuesday morning 6 months after the gala, when I unlocked the Elmwood Events office at 7 a.m., and found 3 of my senior staff already there, making coffee and talking through the upcoming season. People who had been there long before I arrived, who had chosen to stay, who trusted that what we were building together was worth continuing to build. That trust, I had come to understand, was not something you could inherit. It was not something you could buy, or be handed, or claim through a family name. It was something you had to earn, one day at a time, with everything you had.